Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Part 1, Chapter 3. The amusing way in which he is dubbed a knight. As he was tormented by that thought, he made short work of his meagre pot-house supper. Then he called for his host, shut himself up with him in the stable, and fell upon his knees, saying, "I will never rise from this place, valorous knight, until your courtesy grants me the boon I seek, one that will redound to your glory and to the advantage of the human race." The innkeeper, seeing his guest at his feet, and hearing such words, stared at him in bewilderment, without knowing what to do or say. He tried to make him get up, but in vain, for the latter would not consent to do so until the boon he demanded was given. "I expected no less from your magnificence," answered Don Quixote, "and so I say unto you that the boon I have demanded, and which you out of your liberality have granted unto me, is that tomorrow morning you will dub me a knight. This night I shall watch over my arms in the chapel of your castle, and tomorrow, as I have said, you will fulfill my earnest desires, so that I may sally forth through the four parts of the world in the quest of adventures on behalf of the distressed, as is the duty of knighthood and knights-errant who, like myself, are devoted to such achievements." The host, who was, as we said before, a bit of a wag, and already had some doubts about his guest's sanity, now found all his suspicions confirmed. But he resolved to humor him so that he might have sport that night. He told the knight that his wishes were very reasonable, for such pursuits were natural to knights so illustrious as he seemed and as gallant bearing showed him to be. He added that he himself, in the days of his youth, had devoted himself to the same honorable profession, and had wandered over various parts of the world in search of adventures, and, moreover, he had not failed to visit the curing grounds of Malaga, the Isles of Riaran, the precinct of Seville, the aqueduct square of Segovia, the olive field of Valencia, the rondel of Granada, the shore of Sanlúcar, the colt fountain of Cordoba, the taverns of Toledo, and divers other haunts, where he had proved the nimbleness of his feet and the lightness of his fingers, committing wrongs in plenty, accosting many widows, deflowering certain maidens, tricking some minors, and finally making himself known and famous to all the tribunals and courts over the length and breadth of Spain. At last he had retired to this castle, where he lived on his own and on other men's revenues, entertaining therein knights-errant of every quality, solely for the great affection he bore them, and that they might share their goods with him in return for his benevolence. He further told them that in his castle there was no chapel where he could watch over his arms, for he had knocked it down to build it anew. However, in case of necessity he might watch over the arms wherever he pleased, and therefore he might watch that night in the castle courtyard, then the following morning. With God's help, the required ceremonies would be carried out in such a way that he would be dubbed a knight so effectively that nowhere in the world could one perfect be found. He asked if Don Quixote had brought any money. "Not a farthing," answered the knight, "for I have never read in the stories of knights-errant that they ever carried money with them." "You are mistaken," answered the landlord, "for admitting that the stories are silent on such a matter, seeing that the authors did not think it necessary to specify such obvious requirements as money and clean shirts, yet there is no reason to believe that the knights had none. On the contrary, it was an established fact that all knights-errant, whose deeds fill many a volume, carried their purses well lined against accidents, and, moreover, they carried in addition to shirts a small chest of ointments to heal their wounds, for in the plains and deserts where they fought and were wounded there was no one to cure them, unless they were lucky enough to have some wise enchanter for friend, who straightway would send through the air in a cloud some damsel or dwarf with a phial of water possessed of such power that upon tasting a single drop of it they would instantly find their wounds as perfectly cured as if they had never received any. But when in past ages the knights had no such friend, they always insisted that their squires should be provided with money and such necessities as lint and ointments, and when they had no squires, which was very seldom, they themselves carried those things on the crupper of their horse, in saddle-bags so small that they were scarcely visible, for except in such a case the custom of carrying saddle-bags was not allowed among knights-errant. I must therefore advise you," he continued, "nay, I might even command you, seeing that you are shortly to become my godson in chivalry, never from this day forward to travel without money or without the aforesaid necessaries, and you will see how serviceable you will find them when least you expect it." Don Quixote promised to follow his injunctions carefully, and an order was given for him to watch over his armor in a large yard adjoining the inn. When the knight had collected all his arms together, he laid them on a stone trough which was close by the side of a wall. Then, embracing his buckler and grasping his lance, he began with stately air to pace up and down in front of the trough. And as he began his parade, night began to close in. The landlord, meanwhile, told all who were in the inn of the madness of his guest, the arms vigil, and the knighthood dubbing that was to come. They were astonished at such a strange kind of madness, and they flocked to observe him at a distance. They saw that sometimes he paced to and fro, and at other times he leant upon his lance, and gazed fixedly at his arms for a considerable time. It was now night, but the moon shone so clearly that she might have also vied with the luminary which lent her splendor, and thus every action of her new knight could be seen by the spectators. Just at this moment, one of the muleteers in the inn took into his head to water his team of mules, to do which it was necessary to remove Don Quixote's arms from the trough. But the knight, as he saw him approach, cried out in a loud voice, "O thou, whosoever thou art, rash knight, that dost prepare to lay hands upon the arms of the most valiant knight errant who ever girded sword, take heed and touch them not, if thou wouldst not leave thy life in guerdon for thy temerity." The muleteer paid no heed to this warning. It would have been better for him if he had. But seizing hold of the armor by the straps, he threw it a good way from him. No sooner did Don Quixote perceive this than, raising his eyes to heaven and fixing his thoughts, as it seemed, upon his lady Dulcinea, he said, "Assist me, O lady, in this first affront which is offered to thy vassal's heart. Let not thy favor and protection fail me in this first encounter." Uttering these and similar words, he let slip his buckler, and raising the lance in both hands, he gave the muleteer such a hefty blow on the pate that he felled him to the ground in so grievous a plight that if he had followed it with a second there would have been no need of a surgeon to cure him. This done, he put back his arms and began to pace to and fro as peacefully as before. Soon after, another muleteer, without knowing what had happened, for the first still lay unconscious, came out with the same intention of watering his mules, and began to take away the arms which were encumbering the trough, when Don Quixote, not saying a word or imploring assistance from a soul, once more dropped his buckler, lifted up his lance, and without breaking it into pieces, opened the second muleteer's head in 4 places. All the people in the inn rushed out when they heard the noise, and the landlord among the rest. As soon as Don Quixote saw them, he braced on his buckler, and laid his hand upon his sword, saying, "O lady of beauty, strength and vigor of my enfeebled heart, now is the time for thee to turn the eyes of thy greatness upon this thy captive knight, who stands awaiting so great an adventure." These words, as he believed, filled him with such courage that if all the muleteers in the world had attacked him, he would not have retreated 1 step. The wounded men's companions, seeing them in such an evil plight, began from afar to rain a shower of stones upon Don Quixote, who defended himself as best he could with his buckler, but he did not dare to leave the trough for fear of leaving his arms unprotected. The landlord shouted to them to let him alone, for he had already told them the man was mad, and, as such, he would escape scot-free even if he killed every one of them. Don Quixote shouted still louder, called them caitiffs and traitors, and the lord of the castle a cowardly, base-born knight for allowing knights-errant to be treated in such a manner. "I would make thee understand," cried he, "what a traitorous scoundrel thou art, had I but been dubbed a knight. But as for you, ye vile and base rabble, I care not a fig for you. Fire on, advance, draw near, and hurt me as much as you dare. Soon ye shall receive the reward for your folly and presumption." Such was the undaunted boldness with which he uttered those words that his attackers were struck with terror, And so, partly through fear and partly through the persuasive words of the landlord, they ceased to fling stones at him, and he, on his side, allowed them to carry off their wounded, after which he returned to the guard of his arms with as much calm gravity as before. The landlord did not relish the mad pranks of his guest, so he determined to make an end of them, and give him his accursed order of chivalry before any further misfortune occurred. And so, going up to him, he excused himself for the insolent way those low fellows had treated him without his knowledge or consent, but he added that they had been well chastised for their rashness. He repeated what he had said before, that there was no chapel in that castle, nor was one necessary for what remained to be done, for the chief point of the knighting ceremony consisted in the accolade and the tap on the shoulder, according to the ceremonial of the order, and that might be administered in the middle of a field. That he had performed the duty of watching over his armor, for he had watched more than 4 hours, whereas only 2 were required. All this Don Quixote believed, and said that he was then ready to obey him, but he begged him to conclude with all the brevity possible. For if he should be attacked when he was armed a knight, he was determined not to leave one person alive in the castle, except those whom, out of respect for the governor of the castle, and at his request, he would spare. The governor, being warned and alarmed at possible consequences, brought out forthwith a book in which he kept his account on the straw and barley supplied to the muleteers, and with a stump of candle, which a boy held lighted in his hand, and accompanied by the 2 damsels above mentioned, he went over to Don Quixote and ordered him to kneel. He then read in his manual, as if he had been repeating some pious oration. In the midst of the prayer he raised his hand and gave him a good blow on the neck, and after that gave a royal thwack over the shoulders, all the time mumbling between his teeth as if he was praying. After this he commanded one of the ladies to gird on his sword, which she did with singular self-possession and gravity, and plenty was needed to prevent them all from bursting with laughter at every stage of the ceremonies. But the prowess they had beheld in the new knight made them restrain their laughter. As she girded on the sword, the good lady said, "God make you a fortunate knight, and give you success in your contests." Don Quixote demanded then how she was called, that he might henceforth know to whom he was beholden for the favour received, for he was resolved to give her a share in the honour which his valour should obtain. And she answered with great humility that she was called La Torsa, and was a cobbler's daughter of Toledo, who lived near the stalls of Sancho Bienaya Square, and that she would always serve him and consider him her lord, wherever she happened to be. Don Quixote replied, requesting for her sake to call herself henceforth Lady Tolosa, which she promised to do. The other lady buckled on his spur, and he answered her in very nearly the same terms as the lady of the sword. He asked her name, and she said she was called La Molinera, and was daughter of an honest miller of Antequera. Don Quixote told her also to take a title and call herself Lady Molinera, and he offered her his services. Now that the strange and unique ceremonies had been thus speedily finished, Don Quixote could not rest until he found himself mounted on horseback and sallying forth in quest of adventures. Wherefore, after saddling Rocinante, he mounted, and embracing his host, he said so many extravagant words in thanking him for having dubbed him a knight, that it is impossible to tell them. The landlord, that he might speed the parting guest, answered him in no less rhetorical flourishes, but in briefer words, and without asking him to pay for his lodging, he let him go with a Godspeed.